in a splendid debating hall. The atmosphere felt charged and vibrant. The auditorium was filled with scholars, students, and seekers of truth, all eager to witness an unusual confrontation. On the stage stood an older man with an imposing presence. Dr. Parker, a 62-year-old atheist scientist, renowned for his strong arguments against the existence of God. However, what truly caught everyone's attention was not only Dr. Parker, but his opponent, a 7-year-old boy who stood with firm confidence. His name was Aurelian, a young Muslim with an innocent face, but endowed with remarkable intelligence. The audience murmured in disbelief. How could a mere child stand before a scientist who had spent decades debating and researching the non-existence of God? Was this a joke, or was something much deeper about to happen? Dr. Parker gave an arrogant smile, clearly underestimating his opponent. "All right, little one," he said in a calm but condescending tone, "you want to prove that God exists. I have debated professors and philosophers, and I have always had an answer for them. What could you possibly bring to the table that I haven't heard before?" Aurelian didn't hesitate for a moment. Instead, he put his hand into his small pocket and took out a handful of salt, showing it to everyone present. "Doctor," he asked clearly, "could you describe the taste of this salt without tasting it first?" An absolute silence filled the room. The attendees looked at each other, confused, trying to grasp the meaning of the question. Dr. Parker raised an eyebrow and replied, "Of course not. I would have to taste it first to know how it tastes." Aurelian nodded slowly. "So, if you cannot see or feel something before experiencing it, does that mean this salt does not exist?" Dr. Parker hesitated, as he had not expected such a question from a child. A murmur began to spread among the audience as some started to understand the depth of what Aurelian was proposing. Gathering himself, Dr. Parker leaned back in his seat and let out a laugh. "Clever trick," he said, still with a tone full of condescension. "But listen carefully, boy. The difference between salt and God is that salt can be verified. I can see it, touch it, and taste it. To confirm its existence, I simply need to experience it physically. But God, no one can see, touch, or experience him directly. So how do you expect to compare something that can be scientifically demonstrated with something that rests solely on faith?" Some spectators nodded, considering Dr. Parker's reasoning convincing. However, Aurelian showed no surprise but rather smiled. "Doctor, you mentioned that you cannot know the taste of salt without tasting it, right?" Dr. Parker confirmed with an affirmative gesture. "Exactly." Aurelian showed the handful of salt again. "What if someone was born without the sense of taste? What if there are people incapable of distinguishing salty or sweet flavors? Would that mean that salt has no taste?" The room fell silent again. Dr. Parker frowned, visibly confused, and hesitated before answering. "Well, no. Salt still has its taste. It's just that the person lacks the ability to detect it." Aurelian's smile widened. "Exactly. So, if someone cannot taste something, does that mean it does not exist, or simply that they lack the faculty to perceive it?" Surprised murmurs were heard among the audience. Whispers spread as those present realized the boy had just challenged the scientist's logic. For the first time during the debate, Dr. Parker seemed momentarily speechless. Regaining his composure, he leaned forward. "You make an interesting argument," he acknowledged, "but the difficulty isn't that humans lack the ability to perceive God. The real issue is that God never manifests tangibly. If he truly exists, why doesn't he show himself to us? Why should we believe without evidence?" Several people in the audience nodded, as that question had put many skeptics on the spot. However, Aurelian did not seem the least bit troubled. In fact, he smiled slightly. "Doctor," he said softly, "may I ask you a simple question? Dr. Parker looked at him for a moment before answering. Of course, go ahead. Aurelian took a deep breath. Do you love your mother? Dr. Parker blinked, bewildered by the unexpected question. After a brief pause, he answered, Of course. Aurelian nodded gently. Could you show me, in any visible way, the love you feel for your mother? Dr. Parker remained silent. Aurelian continued, Love is something intangible that cannot be seen, touched, or measured, but we all recognize that it exists. We perceive it, observe its effects and actions, and understand its presence even though we cannot touch it directly. He paused, then fixed his gaze on Dr. Parker. The same happens with God. Even though we don't see him directly, we can feel his presence, notice his signs in our lives, and recognize his existence through creation. Just as love does not need to be visible to be real, God does not need to appear physically to exist. We only need to open our hearts to perceive him. A deep silence took over the room. Several of those who had earlier shown approval towards Dr. Parker now looked doubtful. Even Dr. Parker himself showed signs of discomfort. He cleared his throat, sat up straighter, and tried to steer the debate back in his favor. You mentioned emotions, personal experiences, he said, but in the scientific realm, we cannot rely solely on what is felt. We require concrete evidence. If you claim that God is real, where is the proof? Is there any tangible evidence that God created the universe? Isn't it possible that science can explain everything without invoking God? Aurelian took a deep breath and picked up another small pinch of salt, carefully letting it rest in the center of his hand. Do you know why salt tastes salty? Dr. Parker let out a sarcastic laugh. Of course, its formula, sodium chloride, has chemical properties that produce that salty taste. Aurelian smiled slightly. Correct, but tell me, is salt aware that it is salty? Dr. Parker frowned in confusion. What kind of question is that? No, salt is not conscious. It is simply a lifeless substance, incapable of perceiving its own characteristics. Aurelian nodded calmly. Exactly. Salt does not understand itself. But we, who possess consciousness, don't we have the ability to perceive and understand things that lack self-awareness? In the same way, the universe cannot explain itself, but we, as conscious beings, can notice that there is a force directing everything, an intelligence that defined natural laws, created harmony, and allowed life to exist. He fixed his gaze on Dr. Parker's eyes. That intelligence is what we call God. For the first time in his entire career, Dr. Parker didn't know what to say. He clenched his fingers against the table, searching for a response that wouldn't come. He had debated with experts, thinkers, and scholars of religion, and yet now he found himself cornered by the clarity and depth of reasoning from a 7-year-old child. The atmosphere was tense. The audience remained still, surprised by what they had just witnessed. Those who had previously supported Dr. Parker began to look at Aurelian with new eyes, some even questioning their own beliefs. Finally, Dr. Parker took a deep breath. He needed to regain his composure before emotions completely overwhelmed him. All right, he murmured in a softer tone, though still determined. I understand the direction of your reasoning, Aurelian, but there is one question that remains unanswered, even for the most recognized religious figures. If God really exists, how do we explain so much pain in the world? Why do wars, hunger, and natural disasters happen? If God represents absolute love, why does he allow children to die from lack of food, the innocent to suffer, and people to harm each other? Several attendees, who had been moved by Aurelian's words earlier, began to nod. It was a recurring doubt in discussions about the presence of the divine. However, Aurelian remained calm. There was no sign of unease on his face. He nodded slowly, as if that question had been on his mind for a long time. "Good observation, doctor," he said in a serene tone, "and I would like to answer with something as simple as salt." He turned to the audience. "Who here has ever tasted food that had too much salt?" Several hands went up, including Dr. Parker's. "How do you know?" asked a man from the front row. "Because it doesn't taste good. Too much salt makes you thirsty," came the reply. Aurelian nodded his head. "And what happens when a dish has no salt at all?" "It has no flavor," a woman answered. Aurelian then looked at Dr. Parker. "Doctor, salt is beneficial, isn't it? But if used in excess, the food becomes inedible. On the other hand, if it is not added at all, the dish is bland. So is salt good or bad?" Dr. Parker paused before answering. "It depends on the dose." Aurelian smiled. "Exactly. The same happens with suffering, doctor. If the world were only full of joys and we never experienced pain, will we be able to understand what true happiness means? If we didn't know suffering, would we value health? And if we never faced obstacles, how could we appreciate the taste of victory?" He paused for a moment, letting his words resonate among those present. God created this world with harmony, like salt that gives flavor to food. Not all pain is punishment, nor is all joy a reward. Both teach us something. This life is an evaluation, and people have the freedom to decide how to face it. If everyone were forced to act rightly without the ability to choose, could that be considered true goodness? The audience began to reflect more deeply. Even some of the most skeptical seemed to be reconsidering their ideas. Dr. Parker bit his lip. He hadn't expected such a profound idea from such a young child using something as ordinary as salt. However, he was not ready to give up yet. He settled into his seat and remarked, "Well, I understand your reasoning, but I still have a question. Why does God need to test us? If he knows everything, doesn't he already know who will pass the test and who won't?" Aurelian smiled again. "Doctor, have you ever been a teacher?" Dr. Parker frowned. "Of course, I've been teaching at the university for decades." "Then, when you give an exam to your students, do you already know who will pass and who won't?" Dr. Parker sighed. "Yes, usually I can deduce it based on how they've studied throughout the semester." Aurelian nodded his head. "So, if you already have a clear idea, why do you still administer the exam?" Dr. Parker didn't answer right away. "You can already tell who has worked hard and who has been negligent," Aurelian continued. "But the exam still takes place, right? Why? Because the evaluation isn't only for you as a teacher, but also for the students, so they recognize their shortcomings, work on them, and manage to improve." A new silence filled the room. Aurelian looked at Dr. Parker with a determined and firm expression. "Something similar happens with God. He knows everything. He knows who will succeed and who will not, but the tests are not for him. They are for us, so we can discover where our faith stands and thus grow, strengthen, and move forward. If we never face challenges, how would we know what we are capable of?" Dr. Parker lowered his gaze. Those words struck him deeply. He had always thought that science had an answer for everything, but that day a young boy had made him reconsider his convictions. He tried to find a reply, but none seemed strong enough. The audience, which had remained attentive, now seemed deeply touched. Some even shed tears. A man in the back raised his hand, his voice breaking with emotion. "This boy is only 7 years old, but what he has said has touched me more than any academic debate I have witnessed. I feel something moving inside me after hearing him." A woman, nodding gently, added, "I feel the same way. I always saw religion as something strict and full of rules, but today I have discovered a depth that goes beyond logic." Dr. Parker raised his eyes to Aurelian. This time, there was not a trace of superiority in his eyes, only amazement and something harder to identify, a crack in his convictions. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but something inside him had begun to change, and he understood this discussion was far from over. Sitting silently, Dr. Parker reflected. For years, he had dominated every conversation, but this time, everything was different. Aurelian's words had shaken his thoughts. Every argument he presented was met naturally and backed by such solid logic that he was left without rebuttals. However, despite the growing uncertainty he felt, his pride clung tightly. He could not allow a 7-year-old child to expose him in front of the audience. He took a deep breath and straightened in his seat. All right, Aurelian, I acknowledge that your explanation about the test is quite interesting, but I still have a question. If a just God truly exists, why is there so much inequality in the world? The room fell into a deep silence again. With a firm and confident voice, Dr. Parker continued, Look at the world around us. There are people who work hard all their lives and yet remain in poverty, while others are born into wealthy families and have everything without lifting a finger. Some children come into the world with severe conditions, and others arrive perfectly healthy. Honest and kind people suffer, while those who act wickedly live surrounded by luxury. If God were truly fair, why does reality seem so unjust? Several attendees began to nod slowly, acknowledging the complexity of the issue, a concern even believers struggle with. Aurelian remained silent for a few seconds, then looked calmly into Dr. Parker's eyes, raised his hand, and pointed to a glass of water resting on the table. Doctor, have you ever seen water spill from glass? Dr. Parker furrowed his brow. Of course, that has happened to all of us. So, when the liquid falls to the floor, do you immediately consider it lost? Dr. Parker paused to think. Well, if it was an accident, yes, I would say it was wasted. Aurelian gave a slight smile. But what if that spilled water is absorbed by the earth and later helps new plants grow? Would you still say it was wasted? The doctor remained silent. Aurelian continued. Is that what you call injustice? You're only seeing part of the picture, doctor, but you forget that existence is not limited to what happens here. Just like spilled water, we're not always able to perceive immediately its ultimate purpose. Often, we don't understand the larger plan behind it. The fact that something seems unjust in this world doesn't mean that true justice does not exist. He locked eyes with the doctor and, with a calm but firm voice, added, This life is not the final destiny, doctor. This world is just a fragment of a journey. True justice may not be manifested here, but it will surely come in due time. Those who do good and suffer now will receive their reward later. Those who do wrong and seem to go unpunished cannot escape forever. God is deeply just, but we, as humans, often despair waiting for immediate results, forgetting that our existence does not end in this realm. The room fell into complete silence. Several people lowered their gaze, as if Aurelian's words had opened something inside them. However, Dr. Parker still struggled to maintain his stance. He gently tapped the table with a finger and said, But how can you be so sure that there is something after death? There is no scientific evidence to confirm it. No one has come back from the beyond to tell us what happens. What makes you so certain that there is some kind of reward after dying? Aurelian gave him a smile. Doctor, have you ever had a dream? Dr. Parker frowned. Of course, we have all dreamed at some point. And when you dream, do you realize that you are dreaming? The doctor was silent for a moment before answering. Not always. Sometimes I feel it's completely real until I wake up. Aurelian nodded calmly. That is exactly what happens with this life, doctor. What we experience here is like a dream, and death is the moment we finally wake up. When someone has a nightmare, everything feels real, the fear, the pain. But when they open their eyes, they understand it was only temporary. This existence is just a fraction of a much longer journey. The true awakening comes at the end, when we leave this world behind. Dr. Parker did not answer immediately. The boy's words struck deeply in his mind. For years he had placed his faith in science and reason, but Aurelian's explanation was so simple and, at the same time, so hard to accept. A woman sitting in the last row raised her hand and said, "I had never seen it from that perspective before. I have always felt that life is full of injustices. But if it's true that this existence is only a small part of a larger journey, then maybe there is a higher justice we have yet to understand." A public relations representative beside her added, "Yes, I have wondered about this too. There's so much pain in the world, but maybe we just failed to see the whole picture." For the first time in his life, Dr. Parker felt a heaviness in his chest. Everything he had believed in seemed to be crumbling. He looked back at Aurelian with eyes now more compassionate. "So, you think this world is only a small part of something bigger?" Aurelian nodded with conviction. "That's right, Doctor. This world is not the final destination, only a place to pass through. Just as you cannot judge an entire journey by a single day, we cannot assess God's justice based solely on this life." Dr. Parker lowered his head, his mind flooded with questions he had never asked himself before. For the first time in his existence, he had no answers, and inside him a change began to take shape. His once sharp gaze softened, turning into a difficult-to-describe expression, a mixture of awe, reflection, and perhaps some surrender. For years he had insisted that everything must be proven through science, logic, and concrete data. But that day, a 7-year-old child had challenged his convictions in a way he had never anticipated. Silence filled the room. All eyes were fixed on Dr. Parker, waiting for his reaction. Some audience members showed emotions. Others were deeply absorbed in their thoughts. Finally, Dr. Parker broke the silence with a softer voice than before. "I have never heard an explanation like that. I always believed that life was limited to what we can perceive with our senses, but you have shown me a different point of view. You have made me question whether I have been seeing the world from only one perspective all this time." Aurelian smiled warmly. "Doctor, there is nothing wrong with questioning. The search for truth is part of our path, even if sometimes truth is not only something we see, but something we feel in our hearts." Dr. Parker took a deep breath. He understood he had been prideful in his way of thinking, always trying to find answers that fit his logic without considering that there might be something beyond his understanding. He looked at the boy before him and, in a softer tone, asked, "So, do you believe that God is present even though we cannot see him?" Aurelian replied, "Doctor, have you ever seen the wind?" Dr. Parker frowned. "No, I can only perceive it and observe its effects." "It's the same with God," Aurelian answered. "We cannot see him directly, but his presence is manifested in everything around us. We can notice how the cosmos is so perfectly organized, how our hearts experience love and compassion, and how justice appears even if it is not always immediately evident. All these are evidence that God exists." Dr. Parker lowered his gaze. The child's words had deeply moved him. "I don't know how to respond," he finally admitted. Someone in the audience began to clap softly, and soon others joined in. Not because there was a winner or a loser, but because everyone felt that something extraordinary had just happened. Dr. Parker looked at Aurelian intently. "I can't say I suddenly believe, but today you've given me something far more valuable than any argument I've ever had. You've given me a new idea worth exploring." Aurelian smiled. "Seeking the truth is the first step, Doctor. Allah always guides those who do so with sincerity." The atmosphere in the room immediately grew warmer. What had begun as a debate turned into a meaningful learning experience for everyone. Dr. Parker stood and extended his hand. "Thank you, Aurelian. This day will remain in my memory." Aurelian returned the handshake with deep respect. I hope you find the answers you're looking for, Doctor. The room filled with heartfelt applause, not for a victory, but in recognition that something important had taken place. It wasn't merely a clash between reason and faith, but a demonstration of how the two can complement each other. Many believe that everything must be proven through science and logic. However, there are many things in this world that cannot be explained through numbers or theories. The existence of God, true justice, and life after death require more than material evidence. They demand a heart willing to accept and a mind open enough to understand on a deeper level. Aurelian, with his blend of purity and wisdom, showed us that faith is not merely something to be remembered or recited, but an experience that can be perceived and grasped through proper reasoning. For his part, Dr. Parker, despite his many years in the academic world, realized there were still aspects he had yet to fully understand. This shows that it's never too late to pursue the truth, as long as we are willing to open our minds and hearts. Life is not limited to what we can observe. There are higher realities beyond our comprehension, and for those who sincerely seek the truth, God always offers His guidance in unexpected ways.